Hi guys! Okay, so we're going to talk about the Latin American revolutions today. Alright, let's get started. Okay, so from 1500 to 1800, Latin America was colonized by Europe, particularly Spain. And these European nations used that idea of mercantilism, which we'll talk a little bit more about next unit, to gain wealth from those American colonies. And then you had Catholic missionaries from Spain and France converting Indians, because again, that whole conversion, the Europeans coming over wanting to make good intentions, but when it's not actually the best of intentions by conversion, that was one of the big things they would try to do. So they were really big on converting the Native Americans of the area. Okay? So there weren't very many women that came over, because again, it's really harsh conditions coming over on these ships. And so the lack of women led to this intermarriage between the Europeans and the Native Americans, and you had this large mixed race population that would make up a lot of different levels of social hierarchy in Latin America that you didn't really see in North America. So for instance, you had the mestizos. Mestizos were the offspring of Europeans and Native Americans. You had mulattoes, which were the offspring of Europeans and African slaves that were brought over. You had Spanish colonists that were living in the Americas that were known as Creoles. So these were just Europeans that had moved over, so colonists, if you will. So the way that I remember it is colonists, Creoles. They all have to start with a C, okay? Whereas the mestizos and the mulattoes are the different intermixed groups, and those both start with an M for mixed. Easy way to remember it. But these Creoles had a lot of land and wealth and didn't have a lot of political power. They were kind of the second-class people because they were just the colonists that came over. The ones that were the highest level were the white Europeans. Okay, so a lot of these like the explorers that came over, they're going to be at the top of society. I'll have you guys make a triangle in class when we're doing notes on this when we get to Latin American Revolution. But just to kind of help you guys remember, it's white Europeans, then it's Creoles, and then mestizos and mulattoes, and then at the very bottom, slaves. Okay. And then you also had the peninsularies, which were these governors that were sent by the king to enforce mercantilism and maintain order in the colony. So they're going to be kind of like your knights, or your samurai, if you will, of Latin America, the peninsulary. Okay. And then again, like I said, the bottom was Native Americans and African slaves, and they were used mostly as workers for these Creole plantations. Okay. So from 1800 to 1830, these colonies began declaring independence from European nations and started establishing these democracies throughout the Americas. So part of the reason you have all these tiny different little countries throughout South and Latin America is from these different independence movements we're going to talk about. So we'll only be able to talk about a few because there are so many. But by the late 1700s, these different Latin Americans were inspired to gain independence because of the success they saw both in the American and in the French Revolution. And these different ideas of the Enlightenment are going to inspire that independence, particularly among the well-educated Creole class. So one of the main ones we're going to talk about is the Haitian Revolution. And part of the reason I included this in here is because even though it's its own separate thing we're talking about, and an own separate thing you're doing for that project, it's part of Latin America, so we're still going to include it in this video. So Haiti was this French colony that had about 500,000 slaves working on these sugar and coffee plantations. And these owners were cruel. I mean, you've heard before about slavery and these plantation owners, but in Haiti it was particularly awful. And they would use really brutal methods to control slaves. And so in 1791, this is the first time and the only time that this successfully ever worked. In 1791, the slaves were not having these plantation owners, and unlike in the Americas, where it took them until the 1860s to finally revolt and create a civil war, in Haiti, like, the slaves took it upon themselves to say, we're not waiting for all the white people to do it themselves. We're going to have our own revolt. And so they're going to have this guy named Toussaint L'Ouverture who's going to lead this slave uprising. And they're actually going to win, surprisingly enough. Like, the slaves win against the Europeans, and it's the only time this ever happens in history. In 1801, they're going to actually do this successful slave revolt, and the slaves are going to take over Haiti. So part of the significance of Haiti as a country is it was a nation created by slaves who didn't like being ruled by these plantation owners. So from 1802 to 1804, these Haitians are going to keep fighting for their independence, and they're going to fight against Napoleon's French army, because at the time, Haiti was a French colony. And when we talked about Napoleon, we'll talk about him a little bit more in my next video. Napoleon's going to end up pretty much kind of giving up power of that because he's so busy being power hungry with the rest of Europe. And in 1804, France is eventually going to actually grant Haiti its independence, and it's going to create their own republic. Okay, so as far as the other Latin American countries go, throughout the Spanish colonies in South America, these different Creoles had a lot of wealth and education, but again, they couldn't participate in government because they were just colonists. So very similar to the colonists in the Americas, they still had the Spanish, white Europeans telling them what to do. And as colonists, they didn't really have much of a say-so. So these Creoles are going to embrace that Enlightenment idea, things like natural rights, consider the governed, all the different things that we've been talking about, and they're going to use those. So by 1810, they're going to start to lead to these different revolutions throughout South America. And these nations are going to gain their independence because of the leadership of these two particular Creole generals we're going to talk about. Okay, so from 1811 to 1824, you had this Venezuelan Creole named Simón Bolívar, who's going to lead this army of revolutionaries against Spain. And Bolivar is going to help create these new nations of Gran Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. The big thing to get with these guys, by the way, is make sure you just get the names and matching them with the countries. All of them are going to do very similar revolutions. It's just getting the names. So, like Bolivar, one of the best ways to remember him, Bolivar is how they named the country of Bolivia. Very simple. And then just also remember Peru and Colombia. Okay, and then you had this Argentinian Creole, San Martin, who's going to lead the independence movement in southern South America, and he's going to create the new nations of Argentina, Chile, and Peru. Okay. Now this one, again, there's not actually a country that you can relate his to. Just try your best to remember. Martin did Argentina, Chile, and Peru. These are all going to be the ones in the south side of South America, so that might also help you. But again, we'll do some practice with trying to remember these guys. Okay, and then the last one we're going to talk about, though, is Mexico. So, unlike the South American Creoles, in Mexico, the Native Americans and the mestizos played the main role over the Creoles. So in 1810, you had this poor but really well-educated Catholic priest named Miguel Hidalgo. And he used the different Enlightenment ideals to call for this revolution against Spain. Because again, just like with all these others, they said, we want our own country, we don't want the Spanish leadership telling us what to do. So Hidalgo is going to lead this army of 80,000 Native Americans and mestizo revolutionaries against the Spanish military and the Creoles who feared losing their wealth. And during this rebellion, Hidalgo is actually going to be killed. So unlike all these other revolutionaries where they live forever and you hear about them years after they've won, Hidalgo actually dies during the Mexican Revolution. But Mexico founded these new leaders to continue the fight for another 10 years. And eventually you're going to come to a turning point in 1820 when the Creoles are going to switch sides and they join the revolt against Spain. So originally, the Creoles were more in favor of keeping the Spanish power in control, and the mestizos, Native Americans, were the ones saying, no, we want our independence. And so you had a little bit of an issue with the different classes, but by 1820, the Creoles said, no, actually, we're going to join forces with you. We also don't want to be with Spain. So by 1821, now that you've got all of Mexico unified against Spain, Spain's going to end up granting Mexico its independence, and that's going to form the Republic of Mexico. Okay, so 1821 is really how Mexico gets started. Okay, and so throughout Latin America, after the end of all these revolutions, new different democratic republics are going to get created. The only difference, though, between all these other revolutions we're going to talk about, Latin America didn't have this history of self-government. The idea of being able to govern yourself wasn't as big of an Enlightenment idea that was carried on to the people. And a lot of these governments actually ended up being pretty unstable. And that's going to create a lot of problems even in 2019. Part of the reason that you have a lot of poverty and a lot of issues going on in these countries is because their revolutions were not quite as successful as ones like the American Revolution or the French Revolution. And a lot of these nations, these different nations are going to create these military dictatorships called caudillos who are going to seize power. And they made a lot of really poor reforms for citizens, if any. And Latin America is going to end up becoming eventually very dependent on the U.S. And we still see that today, particularly with this whole government shutdown thing going on, where these countries are very dependent on the United States because those revolutions all those years ago didn't really pan out that well. But that's all I have for you guys for this one. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.